building an app. It's pretty good. Do you wanna like you don't want to mirror? You want to have like you want to see your notes? Yeah, you want to see your notes? Then you have to. Okay. Next we have Alex, who's a hacker. He hacks on Ember, Ruby, Go, JavaScript, all over the place. He's a partner at Isle of Code, which is based in Toronto. Yay, Canada. And he pretty good hair too, I have to say. I do like the long looks.
Yeah, I do nothing for it. So I didn't even bring a brush. Just this is how I wake up.
I'm jealous. All right, take it. Go ahead.
Thank you. So can everybody hear me fine? I can't really tell. Sweet. So I'm Alex. We're really talking about hybrid apps with Ember. But before I start, I just want to ask, has anybody here ever written an Ember application before? Okay, only a couple. So I think the way I'm just going to retailer this content as I speak is we're going to speak generically about things we pulled from JavaScript writing Ember. It's just a lot of the examples and code I show you will be Ember-based. I'll make a best effort to explain it. If you think I'm losing, you just stick your hand up and we'll slow down a little bit. So who am I? We covered most of this, so I'm not going to go into it. I actually copy-pasted this slide from a presentation about 6 months ago, so I've been doing Ember for about 3 years now. I fell in love with it. Before that, I actually completely hated JavaScript. I was one of those back-end people who thought it was for mediocre devs who didn't know what they were doing. And it was something that I just dumped in Rails views because a client wanted a button to look pretty or something like that. So that's what I do. As was just mentioned, I'm with Isle of Code. Fun little heritage of the name, we called it Isle of Code because the drunker we get, people can't tell the difference between Isle of Code and I love code, and that's why it's called what it is. Really hurts Googleability, but it's a fun name. So we're a JavaScript first firm, primarily Ember work. Everybody in the team is an Emberist for at least 2 years. We do that for a lot of hybrid apps. That's generally what we spit out. And we actually spend about 30% of our time doing open source projects as well. I've actually just taken over maintaining the main Ember Cordova binding, so that's something that we do. If you know Hammer.js, one of our guys, Chris in Chicago, is actually one of the main maintainers of that. We do the main occlusion library for Ember that I'll talk about today. We're actually just about to open source as well an Estimode add-on for PhoneGap and Cordova as well. So that should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So we just covered that. So what I'm going to do very quickly is just talk about the tools that we're using. And then the bulk of this presentation is going to be lessons learned in terms of how do we write better PhoneGap applications, how do we make them actually performant, and how do we tell what's actually going on under the hood. But the one point I always make about Ember, because if you don't write Ember, sometimes there's this reference that Ember people are kind of fanatical about Ember. And it really is that the way I've learned to write code using it and the way I've set up my toolchain, I'm going to take over to every project, even if I'm not writing JavaScript anymore, and even if I'm not using Ember anymore. And even if you write Angular or you write React, and I do like both of those as well, I think it's worth having a look at just in terms of how the project is structured, how the release cycles work. I think this is a really good practice for most tools to get into. So the other thing that's in our stack is obviously a web view. I'll talk about Crosswalk in a second as well because I love it. I'll try and steal this guy's thunder though, so go and talk to him about Crosswalk. You should use it in every project. But what Crosswalk is it lets you standardize the browser that's basically running in your PhoneGap application. The TLDR, if you don't really know what to do with Crosswalk, is if you're going on Android, it can get really messy, right? Different browsers are going to pass your CSS a little bit differently. JavaScript rules can actually work differently as well. A great example would be if you're using Velocity on an older browser, your promises actually would just completely crap out and you're going to throw an exception. If you use Crosswalk, that's not going to happen. So I recommend just every single project, put Crosswalk in there. It's something we do. We do about 3 to 5 hybrid apps every month. So at this point, it hasn't broken for us yet. So last thing I want to talk about before we get into lessons learned is just, how do we actually get Ember into Cordova? And I talk about this because if you come from a different framework, it's good just to see how other people do it. So historically, what we used to do was we'd have this really hacky thing where the makefile is what we did, and it would run Ember build, build our app, kind of minify it all down and compile it, copy everything over the www directory in PhoneGap, and then dump this little piece of metacode in index.html, which will actually initialize the Ember application for us. But since, and this is that Ember CLI Cordova library I mentioned, we actually just put Cordova as a first-class citizen within the Ember application. Cordova is nested in there. The other really nice thing about that, if you're not aware, Ember has a CLI. We've had a CLI for a very long time. So we have, Ember S for your server, Ember build to build your application, and Ember Cordova actually plugs into that. So you can type Ember Cordova build, and it will first actually run through your Ember build commands, copy everything over, and then run your Cordova build commands for you. The other really nice thing is it lets you proxy all of your Cordova commands. So if you need to run a pre-step in Ember before you do something with Cordova, just run Ember Cordova and you can actually intercept in Ember before you do anything with Cordova. So let's get into lessons learned. So I try not to repeat content every time I talk, but this is something that I just bring up every time because there's this interesting misconception. If you just write good JavaScript, your hybrid app is actually going to work really well. Problem is very few people know how to write good JavaScript. I think there's a few things that happen here. One is that I feel it's a very recent phenomenon for a lot of very serious devs to come into the JavaScript community. Not that they weren't there before, but there's a hell of a lot more than there was a year ago, and even more than there was 2 years ago before that. The other thing is we've generally been writing for desktops with JavaScript. That kind of lets you be lazy. It's not that you're not exhibiting the problems I'm going to talk about, but you don't really notice them as much. And the other problem is a lot of the examples you find online are actually really bad. They're going to give you a lot of memory leaks. They're not well written. I'm a big fan of jQuery. We use it in a lot of places, but most jQuery examples you see, you should absolutely not follow. I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So just a little best practice within Ember, but I would say that this is a best practice in whatever framework that you're using. We actually bind PhoneGap to a service. And if you're not familiar with what a service is, in Ember, we have our models, we have our routes, our controllers, our components, and a service is something we can selectively inject into every controller, into the application globally, into every route, etc. A really good example of a service would be a session. Right? A session doesn't really belong on any single route, but it's something we want to make globally available in the application as we need it. This is a hell of a lot cleaner than doing something like accessing window.cordova or window.phonegap or whatever it is that you do today. And the other nice thing is because you can abstract that to a service, you can actually have your Ember or your Cordova event bindings in that service and still compile the same app for web. So that's one of the reasons that we like doing this. A good example would be I have an app that monitors network activity. So if the app goes offline, we need to show something. That's not something we're going to put in a Chrome desktop app, but it lets us still build the same application with basically no work. So just handling touch events as well. So now we're getting out of Ember specific stuff. I watch a lot of people trying to figure out, how to handle touch and swipes and pans and double taps and holds. And they write a bunch of jQuery listeners is usually what I see people do. That's really not very efficient. I actually recommend this library called Hammer.js. Again, a little bit biased because people on our team have actually contributed and work on this. But this is why I like it. So this is a really old code sample. Apologies. Obviously today we'd use ES syntax. Obviously today we'd be using constants and things like that. But you'll see we initialize a new Hammer instance on the element that we're looking at. You can actually tell I was really lazy taking this screenshot and had a major exception going on under my Vim window, if you can kind of see the background text. But you'll see we register first a tap, which is a single tap. And this is really nice because maybe you also want to register a double tap environment or a triple tap or something like that. The next one we do is register a press that goes for 800 milliseconds. So maybe again, we want to distinguish between a short hold and a long hold. And then we register a pan event. And a pan event is just moving your thumb basically anywhere across the screen. And it lets us start responding to these actions within our code however we want to do that. That's going to work basically in any library or in any framework that you're using. Hell of a lot easier than what you're probably doing today if you don't use Hammer.js. Next little thing I see people kind of get tripped up with all the time, and again, you can change this with configs. I'll get into how you manage this in a second. But within Android, when you pop up the keyboard, your viewport, generally speaking, doesn't change. It's still the same size. Everything will work the same way. On iOS, once that keyboard pops up, you've actually changed your viewport size. A lot of the time, you won't even notice that this is going on in your app because you haven't reflowed. And I'll get into what reflow is and how that happens as well. But the funny example I see a lot of the time is somebody has a submit button disabled on registration. Keyboard's up, somebody types in their password, the button now unclears itself so you can press it. They've just caused a reflow event and everything on the screen goes down to 50% size. And it's really funny to watch. If this is something that you want to avoid, generally speaking, I use Ionic Keyboard. That at least gives me some knowledge whether the keyboard's open and kind of manage from there. So I've probably seen about half the people we work with fall into this trap, and they're wondering why their screen just randomly resizes or does these strange events. So the other thing I want to touch on is just know which web view is going on. I wouldn't say that if you're not too familiar with how these work, that you need to go and Google them before you write a new piece of code, but start making yourself vaguely aware today. And the reason that helps is that you're going to start seeing as you write code how it applies to what you're doing. And the day this matters, which is probably when you've shipped and you're trying to make it more performant or remove jank, you have a pretty deep understanding now of what's going on, and you've actually seen that manifest in your code. So depending on which platform you're shipping for, you want to be using a WK Web View if you can on iOS, and through Crosswalk, you're going to be using a standard view for Android as well. Main reason this is important as well is it will let you know which JavaScript engine you're using. It seems to be this interesting misconception among a lot of developers that everything runs on V8. That's not true. And if you have an idea of how that works, it will make it easy to figure out, when garbage collection is happening, as an example. Again, I don't necessarily write code trying to understand when garbage collection is going to happen in a first case, but when I'm profiling it and I see some jank, it makes it really easy to see what's going on. So I want to talk as well a little bit about memory leaks. These are pretty prominent in hybrid apps, especially if you're using jQuery. And I just have an example there about how V8 garbage collection works. I'm going to skip through this because I know it was covered yesterday. But at a high level, you have a young generation and an old generation. Young generation gets full, everything gets moved over to the old generation. What's interesting is that on the Chrome DevTools page, they actually say that about 80% of things never make it to the old generation. They're not needed anymore. They get garbage collected, they're disposed, they're never used again. Why this is important is you're running in a single-threaded JavaScript environment. When garbage collection is happening, nothing else is going on in your app. So you're going to cause a bit of a freeze, and the more idea you have of when it's going to happen and how it works, the more you can just start to plan your code around that or maybe accommodate that case. So this is a very leaky example, but I see this in client code all the time, and it's something we have to undo. So you see we have a presumed piece of HTML that's just a body with a div called node in it. And we have node equals node, then we have two references to that node, node and node again, and a reference to the body. And the first thing we do is body remove child, and we think we've done a good thing because we've just removed something from the DOM. But in fact, it's still living in memory. It's not going to be garbage collected because we still have references to that object. And that's generally how your garbage collection is going to work. If you still hold a reference to that object, it's not going to be garbage collected. So we actually haven't really cleared up many resources on the phone at all. So what we actually have to do is null all of the references to that object to actually cause it to be garbage collected. If you don't do that, you're just going to see your memory app just keep going up and up and up, and that's what we call a memory leak. So as you're going through your code, just make sure that you're actually nulling references to anything you've done. Hell of a lot easier. Just another example. This was actually from a blog written by Chris. I've got the link down the bottom there. This is a bit of an Ember-specific example, but you will see this in most jQuery implementations on a framework. And this is actually really leaky as well. So just to explain what's going on in an Ember context here, the will insert element and will destroy elements are just hooks on a component that you can run before an element gets inserted to the DOM and before it gets removed from the DOM. So this is historically where you attach things like maybe your Hammer listeners or something like that. And what's interesting here is you say, we have jQuery this element on swipe, and we're running a swipe handler. Don't worry about that bind syntax, that's basically Ember specific. And we have will destroy element, we're turning off that swipe. But again, that's actually going to be pretty leaky because if we want to clear this fully, we need to store a reference to that listener on the top line. So we might do, var listener equals jQuery this element on swipe. Then we actually have to null the reference to that. If you don't do that, again in Ember especially, you're going to find that your memory usage is just going up and to the right and it's never going to go down. You're probably not going to notice for a couple of minutes, and your app's just going to get progressively slower and slower and slower. You find a lot of Ember people fall into this, especially just because of how the component structure works. Another little interesting thing, this is actually mentioned on the Chrome developer page. If you've never gone and read just the Chrome developer page, I'd really recommend you read it. It will probably only take you 2 to 4 hours, depending on your reading speed. And it will probably teach you more than at least half of the world's hybrid app developers on how JavaScript memory works, how the garbage collection works, how reflow works, and all of these concepts that you really want to know. But one thing they very explicitly point out is that using too much memory is actually very negative for performance. And this is always funny to watch because sometimes I work with clients. They see that the phone's only using 20% of its available memory, so who cares, right? We can still fill the thing up. There actually is a point under which you're going to slow down no matter what you do. So you do want to keep as small of a memory footprint as you can. Again, if you don't know how to do this, I wouldn't necessarily stop writing code until I figure it out. I just go and write what I'm writing, and as I'm profiling code, I try and figure out where I'm having these big memory upticks. My standard pattern is that actually I just test in Chrome and use all the profiling tools there before I build it for a device. The reality is it won't cover everything, but a leak's a leak, and if it's leaking in Chrome, it's probably going to be leaking in Safari and everything else anyway. I should have put a source to that exact link on the page. I'll tweet it out afterwards, and when I put these slides online, I'll make sure a link to explicitly that study is in there. Just another little thing as you're profiling on Chrome, again, if you're not profiling on Chrome, you really should be. It will take you maybe 30 minutes to figure out how to do it, is that you should name your closures so you actually understand how they're affecting your JavaScript performance. So to show an example of that, and again, I have the link from where this was taken straight down the page. You'll see from lines 1 to 7, we just have a large closure, and then we have var_lc equals function. That anything inside that closure is actually not going to be reported properly in the Chrome tools, and you're not actually going to fully understand what the cost of that function was. So you'll see that being rewritten down the bottom to var_lc equals function lc. Now lc is actually going to be reported properly in the Chrome tools, and you're going to have an understanding as to what the cost of that function was. So this is something I typically do. Where you see this really hurt people is things like swipe handlers, where they're listening for a swipe that's firing all the time. They're doing it in a closure action, and all of a sudden, they actually don't know the cost of what they were doing. Another tip I want to make is just to manage reflows. So does everybody here know what reflow is? Some. So for those who don't, reflow is basically the process under which your browser's going through and figuring out what it's showing, where it's showing it, and what am I doing, basically. And it, again, is one of the more expensive things that your hybrid app is going to do. So you want to avoid it as much as possible and generally write code understanding what you're doing and how you're doing it. So what causes a reflow? Obviously, the first thing is resizing the browser window, right? We just drag it up and down, less specific to a phone, but obviously changing the size of the viewport is going to change the size of elements on the page. Using JavaScript computed methods, adding or removing elements from the DOM is obviously going to reflow because we've just taken stuff out, and changing elements class. On reflow as well, it's important to note that you're not reflowing just the div that you've changed. You're basically reflowing the DOM because you have children, parent relationships, so it doesn't actually know what's going on and it has to walk a pretty big tree to figure out what's up. And because of this, you're penalized by having a pretty heavy DOM. So you want it to be as flat as possible and as not nested as possible. And again, in Ember, I'll get to an example whereby we cut that down. But one way to kind of save yourself on reflow as well is to use CSS transforms. Best example I can give you is, again, we work with people and say we want to animate a box just from the top left of the screen down to the bottom right of the screen. And what a naive developer does is they put position absolute, top left, top 0, left 0. Then we do top 10, left 10, but every time we do that, we're causing a reflow, basically. So this is where you get a lot of developers excited about your transforms because they're your hardware-accelerated CSS functions. And if you actually use these, you're not causing a reflow. So if you do need to make something move across the screen, try and use your transforms because you're actually going to be far more efficient. On that as well, what we see people do sometimes is, they don't want to remove something from the DOM, for whatever reason, maybe we're concerned about performance. So they just want to hide the element on the page. So what they do is they do display none. But display none, because we've just changed the class, is again going to cause a reflow. So you may as well have just removed it or done something else. If you do need to temporarily hide something, use visibility hidden, you're actually not going to reflow under that scenario. Where you see this play in a lot, and I'll get to this later, is occlusion-based scrolling, and a lot of the performance techniques there very heavily rely on visibility hidden. So as I was saying earlier, try not to nest your DOM too much because you're going to reflow, right? It's going to happen all over the place. So the best thing you can do is make it not as expensive as possible. Within Ember, the manifestation you see of this a lot is we have components, probably like every other framework, and a component is a div. Every time you declare a component, you basically just put a div on a page. And then what we see people do is the first thing inside that component is they have some wrapper container to put the classes on that they need. Now they've just basically created a div within a div that they didn't need. Because on a component within Ember, you can actually put your class names as you declare the component, and now you only have a single div. The other case you see Embers fall into quite a lot is they know that they're creating a div, but maybe they wanted a paragraph or a span or something like that. Within the Ember component, there's a tag name property. So if you don't want it to render as a div, you can say, tag name equals li, or something like that. And again, now you're not wrapping every li in a div, and you just become exponentially less expensive. Small little tip that I always bring up as well. When we're building hybrid apps, I don't necessarily like people to know it's hybrid. I have no shame in that, but we certainly want to perform as well as a native application or as good as we can. So I tend to add this little bit of CSS. What this does is when we've pressed a link, we don't want it to be highlighted like a browser does because that's not what native applications do. Put in something like this and you'll do much better. By the way, I'm really just covering a bunch of tips here. If you have any interest in kind of discussing them further, I'm here all day. Just come up and find me. Another little Ember hack, although this isn't actually specific to Ember, you see people put listeners on things like divs for a click and then wonder why they're not firing, especially in an Apple environment. There's a bit of a funny thing with how it works in the Apple ecosystem, and you want to put a cursor pointer on anything that you want to fire a click event on. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a lot of cases where just that event never fires. A great example of this would be on any Ember component. If you just have a click listener and go and build the thing natively for iOS, none of those clicks are going to fire. So cursor pointer will save you a lot of time. Next point that I'd like to make is just to understand your framework events. And again, this differs based on which framework that you're using, but I see people all the time falling into these inefficient traps because they're relying on a framework that maybe was primarily built to work on desktop and not in mobile. So a great example within Ember would be that there are a lot of different ways that we can actually get a click or a touch if we're working in mobile. So this is the first one, right? We're in a component, we're in the JavaScript part of the component file, and we've just declared the component and we've put a click listener in there. So anything in that component or any of those children components, we're going to have this click action fire and we can do whatever we want to do. And some other examples, just before I get into why we're showing this, you'll see the first one we have, action name on a button. If you don't know what that syntax is doing, we're just saying that when somebody clicks this, this is the function that I want to have run. And within Ember, there's a specific structure of where that action name should be. And the second line you see there is action name on click. And the very last example you see there is onClick, which is your native attribute that's just part of your standard HTML spec. But what's interesting is that these clicks actually don't work the same within Ember, and I've seen very similar cases in Angular as well. In fact, the first three examples I showed you, which would be this one, and the first two actually just run through Ember's basically event engine. So it's going to go all the way up through Ember and then be dispatched all the way back down to your component. That comes with a time delay, and if you're trying to actually be snappy and responsive, you don't want that time delay. Works perfectly adequately for desktop, doesn't work as well for mobile. If you're using this native handler, you're actually going to work much faster. So start doing things like this. Another great example in Ember is that we have touch events as a native property. Don't use them because it's actually going to run slower than doing it yourself. Again, if you haven't done this before, maybe don't implement it the first time, but as you're seeing buttons, you want to speed them up, it's a good chance to start experimenting and seeing how much faster you can make it go. Another little tip that I see developers fall into is that they drop way too many listeners. And a little side note as well, if you're not familiar, go and read up on the difference between bubbling-based and capture-based for your listeners. Really interesting stuff. I'm a big fan of the capture stuff. We can make it work way faster on mobile. Best example here, though, is we have a big list and a lot of list items in it. What a naive developer does is they go and put a listener on every single one of those list items instead of putting it on the larger just UL, basically. Way more performant. You're going to get what list item was clicked anyway from the event target. Your teardown is going to work a lot better as well. So specific to Ember as well, for those who don't know, Ember has a lot of heritage in Sprout Core, and a lot of things are very, very similar, one of which is the run loop. And if you're not familiar with the run loop, imagine it's just running through all of these, effectively asynchronous actions that we need Ember to do. And the nice thing is that we actually have certain queues. We have an action queue, the render queue. So if you want to do an expensive operation only after things have been added to the DOM or only after a page has been rendered, we'd use our run loop for something like that. If you're thinking this sounds a little bit similar to bouncing or whatever else, philosophically, they're kind of similar. And it solves a lot of problems for you, right? Say we have an expensive AJAX call, but we don't want to run it till we've rendered the DOM. You'd actually start using the run loop for something like that. What's interesting as well is that the Ember run loop has now been fully abstracted to this library called Backburner, which you can use in any framework. So if you start liking concepts like this and you want something to manage all of these queues for you, take a look at Backburner.js and you can inject it into Angular, you can inject it into React, or do whatever you want to do with it. And what's interesting, though, is the run loop solves a lot of problems for you, just getting something to work basic and efficient, but it doesn't solve everything. And the best case I always come up with is, say we're running our model hook, right? We're calling our server and we're loading down a big model, but we also want to be transitioning and animating the screen at the same time this hook's going on. We're still working in a single-threaded environment, so these two things can't actually be happening at the same time. So how do we worry about this? We start looking at web workers. This is a pretty new space. Does everybody here kind of know what JS web workers are? Couple. Okay. Imagine just we can go and spin off different tasks happening on different threads. Implementation is a little bit different to that, but the high-level 30-second version would be that. And what's interesting here is that we can start to do things like have a UI thread and have our model thread be two completely different things. At the moment, if you want to do something like this in Ember, you're doing this manually. This isn't first class within the library. This isn't something that I do on every page or on every route, but I find most mobile applications have 2 or 3 screens that are actually the ones people spend 90% of their time on, and the rest are subscreens, right? Registration settings, stuff that we still want it to be performant, but we don't want to spend 12 hours making it performant. So what we typically do is we spawn off a web worker to handle our UI processing and another web worker to handle our model loading, whatever else. Actually works really, really well. This is a space we're actually starting to explore more, and I know other people are as well, and seeing just whether we can make this native to Ember and native to other frameworks, because, oh God, this is the holy grail. If we can get this working in JavaScript, everybody will be happy. If you are in an environment where you can't run a web worker, for example, and you want to handle these transitions, typically what we do is we just start doing things, like debouncing the model call until we've done an animation. Sometimes we prefetch, just your standard strategies, basically. So another little, Ember library that we suggest people use, again, if you're not an Ember developer, there's going to be something similar within your framework. If there's not, maybe give Ember a second look. But Liquidfire, what it does is it handles our animations between routes, which is something that most mobile applications do, but most websites don't do. So what we're doing here is we're saying when we're transitioning from the route people index to people detail, I want you to swoosh to the left if this is happening. And when we do the inverse, I want you to swoosh back to the right. And you actually define all of these transitions in a single file called transitions.js, and it will handle all of this for you. It is incredibly silky smooth. It's actually probably going to be faster than the animations you can write yourself. So I would absolutely inject this into every single application you're writing if you're an Emberist. Another little funny short one. I see clients get stuck all the time with ghost clicks. If you don't know what a ghost click is, the funniest example I saw a few days ago was somebody who had a tap and a click firing on the same element, was wondering why things were going pretty slow and the screen was like double flashing. So if you are listening to taps, you may want to make sure at the very least you've disabled a click on the same element. Make sure you're not firing events twice. It's really easy to figure out if you're using a profiler. If you don't know how to use a profiler, just put a console log there and see how many times it fires. It's filthy, but it will work. I'm not going to cover this too deeply as well because I know this was covered yesterday. But we come into a lot of clients who aren't actually managing their plugins at all well in a PhoneGap environment. And the best case I've seen is people who have this big list saying install these plugins at these versions and they're a README file. The worst case I've seen is bash scripts, which I think is just filthy and you shouldn't do. So you want to store your plugins. I'm a big fan of just putting them in config XML. We used to run a plugin that put them in package JSON, but we just stopped fighting the framework and did what Cordova wanted us to do. And where this starts to really hurt you is one of the clients we're working on, we're using the Cordova contacts library. And when you pop open that contact picker, if everybody uses iOS, there's a cancel button in the top left. I forget whether it was version 4 or 5. I can't remember which version it's up to. But let's just say it was 5. Nothing was firing on that cancel event. It wasn't telling you that somebody had closed that pane. It wasn't giving you an error. It wasn't giving you success. And that was fixed in 5.01. And we had this interesting case where I'd gone and updated the plugins, but they had no plugin management. So the build was working for everybody. It worked for every single beta tester. But all of the developers were saying that the bug I said I'd fixed was still manifesting. And it's because they weren't managing their plugins at all, and everybody was just on old versions. So just be careful of this stuff. You don't think it's important until you spend 3 hours debugging something and realizing that somebody didn't upgrade. So next thing I'll touch on is infinite scrolling. I mentioned that we do kind of maintain this library. Runs by it is Chris, one of our people. There is video evidence of me endorsing this library before he worked for us, so I'm not completely biased on this one. And the reason Smoke and Mirrors is great is because it uses an occlusion-based scroll. Does anybody here know what occlusion is? A couple, okay. So basically, there are 2 ways that you might want to handle an infinite scroll. And again, what a very naive developer would do is they just add every single element they want to show as a DOM element. And that list would just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're treating the phone as this tiny viewport under which they're going up and down this huge list. And from what we've already spoken about, we know that's a bad idea. We're creating this huge DOM. Every reflow is going to be really expensive. And it's just going to be choppy. And we're going to start increasing our memory usage. What an occlusion-based scroll does, the way Smoke and Mirrors handles it, is it basically re-injects data into divs that are already on the page, and it uses visibility hidden just to have a couple above and a couple below. And you'll find that's way more performant, and you'll go from maybe being able to handle 200, 300, 400 list items before you see jank, to be able to handle thousands of them before you even become concerned. To show an example of this just from the smoke and mirrors page, he's injecting, I can't remember what the number is, it's like 30 or 40 objects every second, and it just doesn't care. It's going to keep going and going and going and going and going. Again, as much as you maybe can't use smoke and mirrors if you're not an Ember developer, just go and find an infill library that uses occlusion-based scrolling and you're going to be good. Next point I want to come on is just animations. I don't mean to always hark on jQuery, but don't use jQuery Animate ever for anything, especially in a mobile environment. Not at all performant. I'm going to show you that. This is from the Velocity page, and I'll get into Velocity in a second. They have this great tool on the front page where you can use all the different JavaScript libraries and run the same animation and see how they perform. So what we're going to do is we're going to animate 250 circles just going left and right across the screen with jQuery. So that's not good at all. And I'm sure anybody here who's tried to build a PhoneGap app and has used jQuery Animate has had that happen. So just that's not letting me go past. The panda's taken over. There we go. So that's not something that we want to be doing. So I usually use a library called Velocity.js when I need to use animations. If you're not familiar, I'd consider it maybe your best choice. It's also pretty slick because your animations will return promises for you, so you can do whatever you need to do from a UI state once an animation is complete. But just to show you the same animation running on Velocity, and that test was run on Chrome. So obviously we're getting much worse when we move to a mobile environment on both platforms, but Velocity will still generally hold up. And just to show how these libraries are recycled all the time, that Liquidfire I mentioned before actually just implements Velocity animations on your routes for you. So it really does work, and it's nice when you're already using 3 or 4 libraries with the same dependency. So last point I want to show you is just a really bad DOM animation and then how we fixed it. So this was just from an old app. You can probably tell this isn't a final UI, but this is what you get when you leave me up to design. And we're just simulating a touch event in Chrome. I missed it the first time. And that's really not very good. So I'd never ship an app that looked like that. It's choppy, it's janky, it's deal breaking. And the problem is we can't always easily spawn to a web worker today. And if we need to handle it today, what do we do? If you're waiting 3 months from now or 6 months from now, I wouldn't necessarily worry. But if today is a problem, you probably want to start looking at Canvas, which you can put in basically any framework. And that's because we kind of want a 16 millisecond target. At least that's what I usually go for animations. That's when a user typically won't know that there's a difference between native, at least from my experience. So to show you the same animation happening in a Canvas-based repo or application, so I always go back and forth on whether or not to recommend Canvas to people, to be honest. It takes a lot more work to do the same thing. You're basically managing your X and Ys yourself. But if you need to make something incredibly performant today, it's probably going to be your best choice. And again, if you're waiting 6 months from now, I'd probably just wait and see what happens with web workers. I have a funny feeling we're maybe not going to be able to match Canvas performance, but get really close to it once UI has its own, effectively, thread. And that's what kind of excites me a lot right now. So how are we doing for time? When did I come on? Pardon? Up there? Oh, sweet. So why don't I just stop there then? And any questions? Nope. So it's a good question. There's a couple of things that we do. Chrome Profiler, I find, is going to find most of the stuff you want, right? Because I'm generally just running Ember server as I'm developing and just rebooting in Chrome all the time. I'm just constantly profiling what goes on. A leak on one platform is probably going to be a leak on the other. The filthy easy example that I give people all the time is if you're building for iOS, just leave it plugged into Xcode and watch what's happening with the memory. That's not going to give you a good profile, but it will give you a good feel of whether your memory usage is increasing, staying the same, or decreasing. So that's also worth having a play with.
No more questions?
Keep going. What else will we talk about here? So one of the other important things when you're doing I can keep going, I can make shit up as I go. I do this all day. So one of the other things when you're trying to write, your efficient JavaScript, avoid closures as much as possible, please. Pre-declare as much as possible, please. If you're not familiar with that, give me 2 seconds, then I'll come back. And what I mean by pre-declare, again, what you see people doing is, declaring things inline as they need them. Within Ember, they'll be doing, this.get within a function. The more you pre-declare, your variables or your constants before you use them, again, just far more efficient. Sorry, I think I saw a question. So, I generally do, because if I have something of the same name, it becomes really hard to figure out what's going on in the profiling. But admittedly, I'm not too concerned with having nice closure names, because I'm honestly only doing it for profiling. So hopefully that answers. Right up the back. Sorry, does what have a significant impact on the profile? So yes and no. Within Ember, it absolutely does. And that's because within Ember, what you see a lot of people doing is, so within Ember, we have this thing called this.get, right? Which is we're trying to get a property that we may not know will come back immediately. What you see people doing is, this.get, passing it to a function as a parameter. You're absolutely going to have a performance, hit there versus actually going and getting it and passing it as a parameter to the function as you need it. So it's cases like that you should really worry about, but absent of performance, I'd say it's good programming practice to pre-declare what you're going to use versus defining it inline anyway. And sometimes people complain that feels a bit heavy and they have to put all these variables up the top. It's probably a sign that you're just doing too many things in a single function, in my opinion. I'm pretty tight about code standards. In fact, we have this linter internally that just cuts off everything past line 80. Like, I don't consider code that goes past line 80 ever. So sometimes had people who submit code to line 82 and I send it back to them and say it's not at 80, not good enough. And it always gets down to 80 every single time. Anybody else? Great, thank you very much.